Hello, everyone. It is good to be with you as we continue walking through the book of Ruth. Today, we're going to be looking at Ruth chapter 2, and it picks up right where we left off in the story. Actually, that last verse of chapter 1. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. To us, that sounds like kind of a throwaway line, but we're going to see here in this chapter that it being during the barley harvest is particularly important to this story, to this account. And so we're just going to start. We're going to start with chapter 2, verse 1, and we're going to walk our way through this chapter. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And as we look at this opening verse of chapter 2, we see kind of this foreshadowing, this setting the scene of another character who's about to come into this story. Specifically Boaz, who's described as a worthy man. The words that are used here in the Hebrew could maybe also translate into like a mighty man, a strong man of valor. This is actually the same phrasing that we would hear used to describe David's great soldiers in 1st and 2nd Samuel or in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, kind of his mighty men of valor. So it could just be saying that he's a wealthy man. It could also just be saying that he's a particularly powerful man, a strong warrior. But we're also kind of pulled into this story here that this was someone who knew Naomi prior to her exodus to Moab, before she had to leave to Moab and now has returned with her husband, now deceased, her sons deceased, and one daughter-in-law in tow. Verse 2, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who is of the clan of Elimelech. And so here we see this foreshadowing coming to fruition. This woman, Ruth, has gone to glean in the fields behind the reapers. And this was a common practice in Israel, a means by which the destitute, those who were poor, widows, could be taken care of. And the practice would be that as the reapers and the gatherers went through the field, whatever fell and was not gathered into the bundle of the crop, these individuals could go in the field and they could pick it up. So they could follow after the reapers, literally just kind of walking behind them, and they could pick up whatever they saw along the way that would be good for them to use. So they could take, in this case, the barley home and they could grind it up into flour and they could make bread. And so that's what we see Ruth doing here. And as she's doing so, she enters into this specific man's field, Boaz, from this same clan of Elimelech. Now in verse 4, behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" So he's looking out at the field, and he sees this new woman that he doesn't recognize, which again, we're talking about small town life here. So as Ruth goes into this field, I'm sure she was not the only one gathering grain, as we'll see later in the story, but she is different. She hasn't been there before. This is the first time Boaz has ever seen her. And so he's asking, who is this young woman? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And as we hear these words, I think it's just interesting that, again, we hear this repetition about who Ruth is. She's a Moabite. She's from Moab. I think this is already the 6th time in the book that we've heard Ruth referred to as the Moabite. The 4th time that Moab has been mentioned since she's been back in Israel, and it's only been something like 6 or 7 verses. So there's certainly this repetition here, this emphasis on the fact that this Ruth isn't from here. She's not one of us. She is from Moab. She is a foreigner. She is not part of our people. Verse 7, the servant clarifies, "She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." So we see that Ruth has been pretty faithfully walking through this field. As we look at Israel today, we certainly see it as kind of a arid desert area, and I think that's probably something to be considering here. But we certainly see her working hard. She's following after all of these reapers, and she's making sure that she is gathering up as much as she can for herself and for her mother-in-law, for Naomi. So we see her kind of faithfully doing this task that God has commanded to his people. Remember, this is a command from God in his Torah that the field should be allowed, the leftovers in the field, the gleaning, should be allowed for the widows, for the poor. So she's faithfully following in the Lord's footsteps here in his law. Verse 8, Then Boaz said to Ruth, Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. So we see Boaz make this really generous offer to Ruth. First thing, when he's saying, keep close to my young women, A, I'm sure there's an element of protection there, but B, what he's really saying is, you get to be the first person in line as this process is going on. So you've got the reapers, you've got the people who are cutting the crops, and then you have Boaz's young women, so the servants, the servant girls, who are following after the reapers and gathering up the barley into bundles, so that way it's contained so that they can take it. When he's saying be close to the young women, he's saying you get to be right behind that process, so you get to pick the best of what's left. So anything that falls out from that process, you get to grab right away. So this is already a generous offer, and it becomes even more generous as he says, have I not charged the young men not to touch you? We certainly see he's already putting his protection upon Ruth. Specifically, I think this is why we see him saying, don't go to another field. I can't guarantee your safety in another field. Here I can, because I am a righteous man and my workers are righteous, and I'm not going to let anything untoward happen to you. And what's even more, he says, when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. This is actually a huge kind of lifting up of Ruth here. It would be customary to have kind of the lowest people drawing the water from the well. So the lowest people would draw the water from the well to give it to those people who needed it. So we can think back to Genesis. We can think of Rebekah drawing water for Abraham's servant. We can think to the New Testament, to Jesus at the well and a Samaritan woman coming out, and she draws the water for him. Again, this was typically the woman's job, was to draw water. And so when he's saying, no, let the men do it for you, again, this is elevating her. This is affording her with special privilege, with special respect. And so then in verse 10, I think we see an appropriate response for her. Verse 10, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? She even admits it right here. She says, look, Boaz, I'm just a foreigner. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve this level of respect. Why are you honoring me in this way? And he gives her his answer. But Boaz answered her, All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord, this is Yahweh specifically, repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God in Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Again, I think we get kind of this taste of small-town life in Bethlehem, right? And maybe there actually are some things to be learned here as we think about ourselves as a family here at Grace. Not that we want to be gossiping, but where we see opportunities to be a blessing to people, we want to make sure that we take advantage of those opportunities. This pulls to mind our Good Samaritan Fund that we're working with right now at Grace. God's people have been very, very generous, and we have a large amount in this fund that we would love to be able to bless people with. But this requires us having our eyes open to the world around us. This requires us being willing, A, to ask for help, B, when we know people who are in need of help, to say to them, to go to them and say, look, hey, my church is doing this thing. Is there any way that they could benefit you? Do you need groceries or do you need anything? We're just looking to give. And so again, this isn't gossip that I think is happening here. I think this is the positive side of that small town life where everybody knows everything about everyone else. There's no secrets here. Ruth and Naomi have come back and their story has been told, and in fact it's filtered its way all the way to Boaz, who has heard of Ruth's faithfulness, who has heard that Ruth has left her homeland because of her great love for her mother-in-law, because of her great love for the Lord, and now is serving her mother-in-law faithfully by going out and gathering this barley. And so Boaz is saying, look, I've heard your story. I've heard of everything that you have sacrificed. I've heard of what you have given up. And now I want to be a blessing to you. I know that there are issues in your life. I know that there are struggles, and that's okay. Let me be a blessing. And I think it's also important to note here that Ruth is willing to accept that blessing. I think, especially in our context, it can be very easy to let pride take control. And when someone offers aid or when someone's just trying to be nice and be generous, our pride tells us, well, no, I can't accept that. I can't accept that gift. This is hard for me at times too. But in fact, I think there is something right about letting those people who have blessings right now be a blessing to us if we are in need. And this isn't necessarily begging, but it is just acknowledging the fact that there are people who have been very blessed with physical created gifts. And the Bible repeatedly tells us that those people who have been given much, much is expected of them. And it is right that in those times where they're looking to be a blessing, we allow them to be a blessing and not let our sinful pride keep us from receiving those good gifts. And I think we see Ruth doing that, and I think we see Boaz faithfully using the resources at his disposal to help those in need around him. Verse 13, her response to this, I love this image. The Lord repay you for what you have done, as a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. We certainly just see this beautiful image of the Lord with his arms spread. In this case, Boaz is using the image of wings. And we're certainly meant to picture kind of like a mother hen, right? Gathering her chicks to herself, bringing them under her wing, granting them protection. I think this is what Jesus is kind of alluding to when he says to Jerusalem as he looks out over it, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, this place, this city that has stoned the prophets who has sent to it. Long have I longed to gather you under my wings. Long like a mother hen gathering her chicks, have I longed to just have you under my protective care." This is the image that's being depicted here, this image of God just spreading his wings out and gathering Ruth in to protect her. It's a beautiful image. You can almost picture a father or a mother just wrapping up their child in their arms when they're crying. Just that warm, comforting presence, that I've got you-ness of that closeness here. It's a beautiful image. Verse 13, then Ruth said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. Again, Ruth is saying, look, I don't deserve this. I know I'm not one of your servants. I know I'm not one of your people, and yet you're treating me like this. This is a great honor. This is a great favor. This is wonderful. Thank you. Verse 14, the harvest has continued a little bit. She's still been working, and at mealtime, so at kind of the noon hour, the lunch hour, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Again, we just see this beautiful generosity from Boaz. Boaz sees this woman who has nothing, and he invites her to eat with him, to eat with his workers. Again, this is where that level of hospitality that's so prevalent in this Eastern culture is just a beautiful image for maybe what we should be doing. Boaz sees someone who's in need, and he welcomes her into his home, even though she's a foreigner, even though she's different, even though she's not a part of the clan, part of the tribe, part of the people. Boaz says, you know what? It doesn't matter. Come and eat with me. He is bestowing upon her a great honor by inviting her to this meal. And we see that this meal is something that is good for her. It nourishes her. It sustains her. In fact, Boaz has enough for her that she even has leftovers. It's like when you go out to eat at any big restaurant, right? And your plate comes out miles high and you get your kind of goodie bag of your take-home box, your little styrofoam box. This is the image that we have here, that Boaz has so much for her that she has leftovers. She has food left over. And then when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So now he's moving her up even further in the line. He's saying, let her glean even among the sheaves. He's saying, even before it's bundled, let her take things if she wants it. And even after you bundle it, take some of the best barley out, and leave it for her to pick up. So again, we see that his generosity is far expanding beyond the Levitical law. The Levitical law was literally just whatever falls out of the bundles, these poor, destitute widows can pick up. And Boaz is saying, no, make sure that she's getting the good stuff. Make sure that she is getting as much as she needs to support herself and her family. We're going to be exceptionally generous. And this, I think, is what we talk about when we talk about feeling like we have an abundance. I think there's times in life where it's so easy to feel like, oh, I only just have enough to get by. And maybe that is true. Maybe there are times where our finances are tight. But for most of us, we do live with just an abundance of resources. And we need to make sure that we're giving out of that abundance. We need to make sure that we're seeing the glass as half full and giving even beyond 10%. I think most of us are in stages of life where that is actually doable. And as we see Boaz doing here, I think it's what we're called to do to the world around us. We're called to just give abundantly, more and more. I think we're even called to give out of our scarcity, although that's not what we see Boaz doing here. We certainly see Boaz as having a great deal of wealth and using that wealth, that property, to bless the people around him. And that's a good and great thing. Verse 17, so Ruth gleaned into the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Obviously, we have no concept of what an ephah is. This is where having like a study Bible with your little notes at the bottom of the Bible is particularly useful. I would encourage you, if you don't have a study Bible, there's certainly a valuable resource because they can just give you some of this information very, very quickly. An ephah would be almost 29 pounds of barley. So she has been gathering all day. She has been working diligently, it should be noted as well. And she has gathered almost 30 pounds. Somewhere around 29 pounds is the estimate of barley. That is a great deal of barley that has been gathered. Now, I can't say I'm much of a farmer, but as I picture barley, as I picture wheat, I imagine that you would have to pick up a substantial amount of it to reach this level, to reach 29 pounds. So it speaks to both her diligence, but it also speaks to Boaz's generosity, to the fact that he has really given her every opportunity to glean like this, to take care of herself, to be given enough food so that she can even have an abundance at home with Naomi. So certainly we see this whole story right now as this kind of faithfulness in the midst of tragedy, right? We started with tragedy in Ruth chapter 1. I think there's no getting away from that. These 3 deaths, and now this kind of widowhood that is upon Naomi and Ruth, it's tragic. But in the midst of that tragedy now, we see God using his people to faithfully provide in the midst of that. Verse 18, and she took it up and went into the city. So she went back to her home in Bethlehem. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. So again, she brings her kind of goodie bag home with the leftovers. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Again, Naomi says it right here. This is not normal. This is not what a typical gleaning looks like. Whoever's field you were in, they were really blessing you today. They were taking care of you, and they ought to be blessed. We need to shower them with praise and thanks, and the Lord needs to bless them for the good that they have done. And so Ruth told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." So she just tells her, this is the field that I was in. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." So Naomi utters this awesome blessing. May Boaz be blessed by the Lord who has not forsaken the living or the dead. And really what she's saying here is the Lord clearly has not forsaken you and me, Ruth. We are the living, and he's not forsaken our dead relatives, our husbands. Because as we're going to see here, the rest of the story is really going to be built upon this redeemer, this kinsman-redeemer relationship. And the Hebrew here used is Gaal, and the Gaal had a number of different kind of responsibilities. If someone were to sell their land, if someone got so poor that they had to sell their land, a Gaal, a redeemer, could come in and they could buy it back. They could redeem that land for that poor person so that they still had a place to live. If someone had to sell themselves into slavery, so again, that sounds weird for us. It would be more like indentured servanthood. In Israel, an Israelite could sell themselves into someone's service. And so they could work for them until the year of Jubilee when they would be set free. And they would be being paid during this time. It wasn't like they were getting nothing for their efforts. They weren't truly slaves. But they would sell themselves into this servanthood. And there was nothing wrong with it per se. In fact, there were some people who would, there actually was a process by which if you enjoyed this servanthood, if you thought it was something that was good for you, if it was how you wanted to make your living, you could, in the year of Jubilee, which is when all of these bonds, all of the land was given back to the owners, when everything was kind of set free back to its original state, you could instead kind of get like an earring, an awl placed in your ear, and that would mark you as someone who wanted to serve the rest of your life. And again, that was not viewed negatively. It just was a different means of obtaining your wealth, or just another means of your livelihood, so to speak. But if you sold yourself into slavery and didn't want to be in that servanthood, the Gaal could come and they could buy you out of that servanthood. The Gaal was also in charge of kind of like managing estates. So, for instance, if you died in an accident somehow and another person was at fault, that person would pay the Gaal. And the Gaal would use that money to keep your estate up and running for your descendants, for your people who would need that money. Also, the fourth one, and this is kind of the bloodthirsty one, or at least we think of it as bloodthirsty, if someone was to commit a murder against your family, if someone were to willfully, with meditation, murder someone in your family, the Gaal was going to be the responsible party for bringing them to justice. And so they would be the one who kind of went after them, and in fact would be in charge of the execution if they were captured and if they were in fact found guilty of this crime. And really, we also see this Gaal used in more of a spiritual perspective too. If you look at Job chapter 19, this is where we get these beautiful words for one of our more popular Eastern hymns. Starting with verse 23, "Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another." This great Redeemer that Job is describing uses that same word, that Gaal. And so I think we are meant to see these kinsman redeemers as foreshadowing of a greater Redeemer to come, as foreshadowing the coming Christ, that Redeemer that Job looks to, that Redeemer that we look to, the one who has bought us back from our sin. So I think actually we are meant to see this Boaz, who, as we might recall, is an ancestor of David, who is an ancestor of Christ. We're meant to see this Redeemer as pointing us forward to a greater Redeemer, this Boaz as pointing us forward to Jesus, who has purchased all of us from our sin and slavery. So I think the fact that this Gaal is so important in this story is important to us as we look at this side of the resurrection, this side of our risen Christ, our crucified Christ. 21, and Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So here we see again some of the sinful reality that's around us, even in Israel, even where we're supposed to see God's people. As Ruth goes out and does this, Naomi acknowledges that there is risk. There is risk that she might be verbally assaulted as a foreigner. There is risk that she might be physically assaulted as a young woman. And I think this is just another helpful reminder to us that evil is everywhere. And sin is everywhere. And it is good and right for us to make sure that we are protecting each other. This doesn't mean that we live in fear, but this does mean that we help keep each other out of negative situations, out of situations where ill might befall us, where we protect one another, where we look out for one another. And we see Naomi saying, look, Boaz is doing this for you. He's protecting you. He's caring for you. Make sure you are staying in his field because he is righteous and there you will come to no harm. And really, I think that's what people ought to be saying about us in general. Because of the righteousness that Christ has given to us, because of the righteousness that he has won for us, when people see us, when they see our businesses, when they see our families, when they see our church, whatever they see, it ought to be in this light that this is a place where you are protected, where you are cared for, where regardless of your circumstance, you're going to be viewed highly enough to be valued. You're going to be loved. You're going to be protected and cared for. I think certainly this is the image of what our churches, our businesses, everything that we're involved with ought to look like. We ought to be those safe spaces, those lights in the midst of darkness, where people can cling when they don't know where else to go. Verse 23, so she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And so as chapter 2 closes, we see that this is how life has gone now for Ruth and Naomi. Throughout this time of the barley and wheat harvest, this has been kind of the day-to-day occurrence. Ruth has gone out to Boaz's field, she has gleaned there, and she has obtained enough food that she and Naomi can continue to sustain themselves without having anyone else caring for them. As we prepare to go, though, into chapter 3, we're going to see that things are going to start to take another turn, that God's going to provide even more fully for Ruth and Naomi in the coming chapters of this book. With that, let's close with a word of prayer. Lord God Almighty, we thank you for this time to gather as your people to hear the story of Ruth, to see these faithful examples of work and service and care for our neighbor. Lord, there are many people in the world who are hurting around us, and we just pray that you would help us to have eyes to see and ears to hear and hands that reach out in love and service to heal those around us, to bind up the brokenhearted, and to speak your saving love into their midst. Lord, you promise that our prayer can move mountains, and so we also just pray that you would be with the world at this time. Lord, you are mighty to save, and in fact, you alone can rescue, and so, Lord, we just pray that you would place your healing hand upon the world, that you would rid us of this virus, that you would restore us to safety and to health. And Lord, it's not just for our physical health that we ask this, but Lord, we ask this in order that we might preach the gospel faithfully, that we might show others your great love, and that we might use this opportunity to show them the greatest gift of all, the greatest Redeemer of all, your Son, Jesus Christ. Lord, help us to live in his promises and to live faithfully in the way you would have us to walk. We ask this all in your Son's name. Amen. Thanks again, everyone, for being with me today. I hope that this was an enjoyable time for you, and next week we look forward to continuing with Ruth chapter 3. Have a nice day, everyone.